So it's my distinct pleasure to be able to welcome everybody to the second part of our University of Kentucky Department of Veterinary Sciences seminars that we're holding today. I'd like to thank deeply and sincerely Boehringer Ingelheim for sticking with us through COVID and for sponsoring this particular series. So very, very glad to have them. Thank you everybody for joining. We are absolutely delighted and excited to be joined today by Dr. Fred Barrelet, who, as you can see from his background, is actually beaming in from England, and his place of work is Rossdales Limited in Newmarket. And you can see that splendid picture of that magnificent town behind him with the 3,000 acres of heathland stretching out. Dr. Barrelet is actually did his veterinary education at Bern in Switzerland, and actually has quite a distinct reputation of having worked at the Swiss National Stud. He's also participates in a lot of FEI events. He has also been somebody who has helped with the Olympic Games. But for the last large number of years, he's been working at Rossdales, where he is a partner, shareholder, and the lead clinical director of that large group of nearly 60 veterinarians in a big practice there. He has interests that include reproductive medicine, but also pretty much anything to do with the young stock and racing stock. So quite an all-rounder, but has specific interests in reproduction and is very heavily integrated into many of the aspects of our global economy with regard to thoroughbreds. So he's very kindly agreed to speak with us today on how his practice handle various aspects of the problems that we face with antimicrobials. Dr. Barrelet, thank you. I will take this down and you can share your screen.
Emma, thank you very, very much for this very kind invitation to join you this evening. The story behind me being with you tonight goes back probably about 2 years or so. Like 2018, indeed it was, when when Kentucky and the breeders of Kentucky hosted the International Thoroughbred Breeders Federation, and I was very, very kindly invited by Des Layden at the time, who was the coordinator of the ITBF's veterinary program, to give a talk to breeders about some aspects that I found intriguing, which are issues around Klebsiella and Pseudomonas. So that's sort of the background. And then you called me, must be about a year ago, and said, would I give a talk? Because I'd made some unguarded comment that we were using fewer antibiotics than before. So I've been scratching my head ever since, trying to demonstrate to myself more than anybody else that my statement might have a ring of truth about it. And so this is what the result of that interaction was. And the more I started reading into this topic, the more I realized that it is a far broader topic than I had initially anticipated. So why this talk? What was the background and the context that is sort of sets the scene slightly? We in Europe, or in the United Kingdom, and here I use the word UK not as the University of Kentucky, but Her Majesty's United Kingdom. So all these comments are geared to my side of the pond. The breeders here in Europe work to a fairly strict code of not conduct, but a code of practice with regards to transmissible venereal diseases in their breeding stock. And one of the issues here is that we take infections with Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Klebsiella pneumonia, with especially the venereal capsule types, very seriously, and any animals that are screened and come up positive to have positive cultures to these infections are barred from breeding until we can demonstrate that they have been treated successfully. So I've always wondered why we in Europe are so strict about this, and why the rest of the world doesn't seem to be as bothered as we might be. And that was a bit of what actually triggered my investigation into what our practices were at our practice. Because mainly I felt that we were possibly over-treating and unjustifiably treating some of these stallions and mares to the point where these creatures were basically being almost abused due to the consequences of the treatments themselves. As you can see, this poor fellow here with a rather raw looking penis, and on the other side there is a mare just demonstrating where clitoral taking of a clitoral swab, but also mares end up having clitorectomies, extended periods of treatment, and a lot of time, money, and effort can be wasted if animals don't respond immediately or very quickly to treatment. And with that, obviously, it has an economic impact on for breeders. So, by the other side of it is, I think also there is a welfare issue when you've had to treat a stallion or a mare for months on end for a infection that is not clearing up. But going on from there, we get into the whole issues of antimicrobial stewardship, and that is really where this talk is going to go. I hope to close the circle at the end, but going from the breeding shed out into the literature and the big wide world, I suddenly found myself reading up on issues or on statements from the World Health Organization, from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and others, and the OIE, and the concern about antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial stewardship. This might seem like we're a long, long way from the breeding shed, but actually we need to look at the bigger picture as equine reproductive vets, because we have our role to play and the responsibilities in this whole issue of what has now become basically a one health policy. And if you look at some of the literature and a basic statement here from last autumn, from last November, by the World Health Organization, you realize that antimicrobial resistance is a global health and development threat. It requires urgent multi-sectoral action in order to achieve the sustainable development goals that the World Health Organization has set. The World Health Organization has declared antimicrobial resistance is one of the top 10 global public health threats facing humanity. Big words, big statements, but I think the more we look at this issue, the more correct they are. The misuse, and this is where we come in with our responsibilities, the misuse and certainly the overuse of antimicrobials are the main drivers in the development of drug-resistant pathogens. I think if we put a mirror up in front of us and hold a mirror to ourselves, I certainly have to tick that box as well. Am I using antimicrobials appropriately? Yes or no? Probably no. The lack of clean water and sanitation and inadequate infection prevention and control promotes the spread of microbes, some of which can be resistant to antimicrobial treatment. And that has a huge impact on the spread of disease, both on the human and animal field. The cost of antimicrobial resistance to the economy is significant. In addition to death and disability, prolonged illness results in longer hospital stays, the need for more expensive medicines, and financial challenges for those impacted. Now, this is aimed at human patients, but I think the same can be said quite categorically for horses and animals as well. Without effective antimicrobials, the success of modern medicine in treating infections, including during major surgery and cancer chemotherapy, would be or will be at increased risk. I think these are all basic statements of fact, and I think sometimes we forget about it in the hurly-burly of day-to-day practice. So realizations that we are in this situation are not new. This goes back 20, 30 years already, and certainly in the late 1990s and in the noughties and the 2000s, World Health and other organizations started putting a focus on these issues. And it's about 2015 the three organizations came together, that's the World Health, Food and Health Organization and OIE, to create a common strategy and common concept of a global One Health policy affecting humans, animals, and the environment. So that's sort of the background of where we're at the moment. The OIE, l'Office International des Épizooties, which is basically is the equivalent, the animal equivalent for World Health, has got a list of antimicrobial agents that are of veterinary importance, and it excludes some from that are used in human health. I invite you to just, if you're interested, to broaden your reading a bit, your bedside reading, and have a look at some of these websites. It is quite interesting, and the more you read into it, the more one becomes engaged. What is the situation here in the United Kingdom? Well, we as veterinary surgeons are governed and regulated by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and it, in its code of professional conduct, states that the veterinary surgeons are, I've got something standing in my way here that I can't see. Let me just get rid of this. Basically states that, excuse me, I'm just struggling with my screen because it's covering some of the text here. Let me get rid of this. And go up here. And I'll take that down there. And now I can see what I'm talking about. Not that that might necessarily be of.
Oh, good.
All good. Let me see. Here we go. Pressing button here. That's it. Now I'm back on course. Now let me get my little laser back, and we're back in business. So the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, our professional body, and its code of conduct states that the veterinary surgeon must prescribe antibiotics responsibly in a manner that minimizes development of resistance. Great. That seems very logical. That is something I think we all aspire to. But we are also regulated by something called the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, which is a government body that regulates the licensing and prescription and use of veterinary medicines in this country. And in their guidance, the VMD supports and encourages the responsible use of antibiotics. This, however, requires veterinary surgeons to take into consideration not only the most appropriate active substances, but also the most appropriate formulation, the posology, the current pattern of resistance in their local locality, and awareness of how to reduce selection pressure, considering MICs and clinical breakpoints when available, and adjunctive requirements, for example, good biosecurity, husbandry hygiene, and avoiding surgical sepsis, etc. If a veterinary surgeon can demonstrate that these steps have been taken, then the cascade of antibiotics is supported. Now, we have this notion of the cascade in Europe, which is also enshrined in European legislation, which the Brits now have decided to step aside from after Brexit, but basically British legislation remains very similar or the same. And basically it tells us that if we have an antibiotic of choice that is not available or not registered for use in the horse, we can go down this cascade and use the next, not the next best, but next indicated drug, and do that without fear of from a legislative point of view. The VMD does not support the administration of antibiotics for the purpose of prevention of disease. Now, this goes hand in hand with what the World Health, OIE, and others are demanding of us. In other words, prophylactic use of antibiotics is not allowed except for under exceptional circumstances. Antibiotics should not be used to compensate for poor hygiene or inadequate husbandry and biosecurity measures. I think we can all relate to these statements, and basically the good animal husbandry, good farm management are part of the strategies to try to minimize the use and misuse of antimicrobials. What does that mean for us equine vets? Well, the British Equine Veterinary Association, the equivalent of the AAEP, in the noughties, late sort of 2000s, through Professors Josh Slater and Mark Bowen. One was at that time at the RVC, Royal Vet College in London, the other at Liverpool University, were instrumental in basically sensitizing BEVA to these issues, and through their efforts, a policy has evolved since about 2010, 2011, which is advisory and educational for the membership of BEVA and their practices. If you want to look at some very interesting work and overview of publications, I recommend that you look at the EVJ, Equine Veterinary Journal, online edition from 2015, which is entitled Antimicrobial Resistance, and it's, as I say, a virtual issue, because that will give you an insight as to the thinking behind much of the advice that we have now available from BEVA. And there are some very interesting other articles that have been published subsequently and also before that that apply to general equine practice and use of antimicrobials. And I've just put in a few examples here from EVJ, more recent ones, Outpacing the Resistance Tsunami, Antimicrobial Stewardship in Equine Practice. There's another one here, A Common Practice of Widespread Antimicrobial Use in Horse Production Promotes Multi-Drug Resistance. There's a saying over here, what's new, Sherlock? But you know, these are papers that give you a good overview and also offer discussion and critique of what we're doing in our everyday lives. So what does BEVA, how does BEVA help its members? It's introduced something called the Protect Me program, which is based on a program developed by the British Small Animal Veterinary Association, sort of in year 2010, 2011. And the aims here really are to develop standard treatment guidelines for antimicrobial surveillance of antimicrobial resistance, enforce the idea that prescriptions, that antimicrobials can only be used under prescription and should not be in the hands of the general public, because the risk for abuse or misuse or inappropriate use of antimicrobials is still is greater there. And we really are aiming at reducing the use of fluoroquinolones, and I would add here cephalosporins as well, as main goals and protected classes of antibiotics that should be only used under very special conditions. And finally, point 4, reduce the financial incentives that encourage the use of antimicrobials. So maybe we have to sit back and look at our ways of practicing and the way we structure our financial services, we structure our services financially, to try to take an onus off the income streams that are associated purely with the selling or flogging of drugs, and try perhaps to consider whether we can recenter some of those revenue streams more into encouraging our clients to invest in diagnostics, so that we can then prescribe the appropriate types of antibiotics. This is an educational process which includes not just ourselves, our co-workers, our colleagues, but also our clients. And it's a way of really slowly but surely ensuring that we have a changed way of thinking, perhaps, in our quest to treat infectious diseases as efficiently as possible with a long-term perspective. So this Protect Me program is aimed at not dictating, but making us reflect and think about our practice policy when it comes to working with prescribing antimicrobials. It aims at reducing the inappropriate use of antibiotics for prophylactic purposes. Look into the options and other options that are available, consider those, and look at further into what types of drugs and the the matchup between drugs and bacteria that we're trying to combat, employ drugs appropriately at the correct dose rates, correct treatment intervals, and base all of our work on evidence, and that is through culture and sensitivity taken from testing for infections, and then treat effectively. Of course, none of this will work unless we monitor it, and with the monitoring is of no use if we don't educate ourselves, our colleagues, and our clients, and others within the industry. So this is sort of an approach that BIVA is encouraging, and it provides this toolkit, if you want, for this purpose. And it's very, very simple. Educate, adapt, or else. And what do I mean by or else? Well, for instance, in the Netherlands and in Germany, our profession is being now dictated to as to which antibiotics can be used and are available to them. And so the state or regulatory bodies are getting involved in dictating and taking away clinical freedoms and freedoms of prescription. So we certainly view it as I certainly think it's very important that this freedom of choice is retained, but the only way we can do this is by educating ourselves and self-regulating ourselves and having the discipline to do so, and getting the industry, horse owners on side. And with the regulators, I mean the regulators in racing, in sports, of various disciplines, the regulators of our profession, and as I say, various bodies. And here the logical thing is to go through this with an approach, a biosecurity approach. And think about your day-to-day practice. It happens on the stud farms that I look on a day-to-day basis. I encourage them and hope to guide them in better methods of biosecurity and so forth. I've already mentioned this special issue of EVJ. I can only but recommend it. And look, if you want to look up the toolkit that's available on BIVA, do so. What I find is quite an amusing educational tool is this one here on the right. And this is a prescription for the client to say, no antibiotics required. And it looks at various conditions, and you then make a decision and explain to the client, no, you don't really need antibiotics for this abrasion on the forearm of the horse or for a foot abscess. But it also predicates and means that I, as the clinician involved, have to thoroughly examine the horse to come to that conclusion that I can give advice to the owner or the manager that no, this horse under these conditions does not need antibiotics, and put in a safeguard for monitoring the horse and saying, but if in such and so, in this expected time delay, when I would expect it to, the injury to heal normally, if it doesn't do so, then I need to see it again, and we might have to review and revise our clinical decision. So what does that mean for Rossdale's? At Rossdale's, as Emma said, we are somewhere in the region of something over 60 vets, and we have a large practice in Newmarket, which is divided into a large hospital and diagnostic facility for our internal referrals from our local population, but also for horses from all around the country and further afield. Our local population is primarily thoroughbred based. We have a large population of horses in training in the local racing yards or racing stables. Sometimes, usually towards the end of the spring, sort of April time, there are roughly about 3,000 horses in training in Newmarket. And in the surroundings, on the surrounding stud farms, we have a vibrant stud farm practice with probably a radius of about 30, let's say 50 miles, 30, 40 miles. And we probably have somewhere around 7,000 breeding stock, be it from foals through to yearlings towards the end of spring when the breeding season is in full cry, and mares are being brought into town for foaling and covering and so forth. So a large local thoroughbred bias. In parallel to that, there is what we call our ambulatory practice, which provides services to the local or relatively local riding horse, sport horse populations as well. And we have a clinic in about 50 miles from here, north of London, which is a predominantly leisure pleasure sport horse practice, and another practice down in Lambourne to the west of London, which is predominantly, again, thoroughbred racing and stud work. So that's the size and setup of our practice. What does this, do we have a coherent antibiotic policy? Well, we have set up, as using the PROTECT model, a Rossdale's tailored policy for antimicrobial stewardship, and it's based on what are two protected drugs or antibiotics, ceftiofur and enterofloxacin. These are the ones that we aim to minimize in use. We have a series of antibiotics that are go-to antibiotics in the first instance. These are these green ones. And then we have alternate ones, which are these purple ones or mauve ones. And this is set up and reviewed annually, if not biannually, and is based on monitoring of the laboratory results that we have. Rossdale's Laboratories is a very large laboratory servicing not just our practice, but the all veterinary practice, equine practices in the country who wish to use our services. So we have access to a lot of information and data. And so the policy review is based on the review of resistance and sensitivity screening, the clinical outcomes of cases, the use and availability of individual drugs, and to a certain extent, the financial implications for the client and the practice in the decisions that we make from year to year. Each department, and I say this using the department as a loose term loosely, but basically each area of the practice has a team leader who is involved in reviewing the antimicrobial policies in their teams. So the hospital, for instance, Emily Floyd, so many of you will have known her as Emily Haggett, is our curator of our antimicrobial policies. She's in charge of running it for the whole practice, but in particular also for the hospital setting. We have those who are on the leader on the racing side, in the racing yards, stud farm, the ambulatory practice, and through our laboratory, we get a lot of input and feed from Dr. Alistair Foote, who heads Rossdale's Laboratories. We involve our pharmacists as well, so everybody is involved in discussing and analyzing and reviewing the results on an ad hoc basis, but certainly more formally, at least annually, through M&M rounds, which are held at the hospital and increasingly so in our more ambulatory settings. So what results can I report for the practice and the use of those two particular classes of antimicrobials since 2012? Well, in 2012, Emily called a meeting and we were all herded into our meeting room, and she told us, this is the PROTECT and this is how we're going to do it. And we sat there and I shaking our heads and say, more regulation, more butting into our day-to-day clinical freedoms. This is nonsense. But okay, fine, we'll give it a go. So we had ceftiofur being used, and this is in grams, I think, yes, in grams on the y-axis there. That was 4.5 kilos, or almost 5 kilos. That's 10 pounds of ceftiofur was being dispensed or used in the practice in about 2012. We got the Riot Act read to us, and by 2013, down it went. Similar class, enrofloxacin, the fluoroquinolones, also dropped in usage. And then, for some reason, all was forgotten. And suddenly we saw a rise again in a leveling out, and then a rise in the use of ceftiofur. And then in 2015, Emily called us back in again and read the Riot Act to us in 3 verses. And suddenly we then saw that the use of ceftiofur started dropping off again. And here, this, as I'm saying, is for the whole practice. It's not reproductive practice alone. This is the whole practice. And enterofloxacin suddenly rose and has spiraled right up there and has come back down. And I'm afraid I've only got 2019 on this screen. I forgot, I omitted to put 2020. It's dropped off a bit. But there was a rise in injectable enterofloxacin, which coincided here at that point also with the loss of availability at one point of the oral preparation. It also coincided with the year of equine influenza in the UK, which may have been an excuse for the trainers to say, oh, my horse is coughing, put it on drugs, or and our vet's succumbing, perhaps. Speculation, but that's an odd peak. If we look at the oral applications of enterofloxacin, you see how that peaked, dropped, and then peaked again in 2014, has dropped again, and is dropping away quite nicely, although it is still a very popular antimicrobial and still, unfortunately, I think, in some areas of the practice being used by as a first resort rather than as a second or third resort or after appropriate testing. So there's better work to be done there, and I think that we can still improve quite a bit. Now, what about antibiotic use in reproductive practice? Funnily enough, if you go through a lot of the literature about and review articles, we in reproductive practice are suddenly not mentioned. It's all about hospital talk, use in orthopedics and so forth, upper airways, but our breeding world, for some reason, is not always mentioned. And so if you look at these indications, these 2 tables of indications and what medications should be used, which is the PROTECT system, then you won't find any reference to any reproductive procedures in here. So treating of endometritis, for instance, is only listed as a post-foaling endometritis, but nothing more than that. So not a lot of emphasis is placed on the repro world, which, let's face it, we are guilty of overusing probably or using antimicrobials inappropriately, quite frankly. So who has actually looked at this? And I think the seminal or very good first review of recent note was by Michel Leblanc in 2009. And I think if we go from a baseline of using that article, because she discusses both the North American and the UK situations, it's a good baseline to start from. More recently, there's a very interesting paper that was recently published coming out of Sweden with a review of antimicrobial resistance in equine reproduction and questioning the use of antimicrobials in semen extenders. And certainly the use of low dose antimicrobials in semen extenders, whilst it is protective in inverted commas and for the preservation of semen, is not necessarily, it can be argued, not necessarily to the benefit of antimicrobial stewardship in mares, in the brood mare. So here in the UK and in Europe, we are governed in the thoroughbred world by something called the Horse Racing Betting Levy Board's Code of Practice. It's also now known as the International Codes of Practice, and it's a very good document, but it really sets out the conditions under which horses mares and stallions can be used for breeding. And it was created in 1977 after the outbreak of after 1977, after the outbreak of contagious equine metritis, which paralyzed the breeding industry in the UK. And as a consequence, breeders got together saying, hold on, we've got to do something to try to prevent the spread of venereally transmitted infectious disease and a repetition of what became known as the Jubilee clap. And it lists various conditions and infections and gives guidelines on how breeders and their vets should behave to try to minimize the spread of infectious venereally transmitted disease. Again, it's actually a very good document because it does give you helping an understanding and help manage situations. It's been expanded to other conditions, other infectious diseases as well. So, and it also has a chapter on artificial insemination. It's adhered to by all the European thoroughbred breeders and increasingly so also by non-thoroughbred breeders, if not in total, but then in parts. What's the aim? The primary, as I said during the introduction, Klebsiella pneumoniae and Pseudomonas and CEM Taylorella genitalis are the main targets to stop those from being spread around the breeding sheds. And as far as Klebsiella is concerned, here only 3 capsule types are considered to be of danger or of imminent threat. Those are 1, 2, and 5. I believe that the ability to capsule type has been lost in many parts of the world, or is no longer pursued because it's not considered to be of economic importance, but we are still regularly capsule typing over here. The problem with Pseudomonas is, as we all know, these are unspecified serotypes, so we can't really say which ones are going to cause a problem and which ones are venereal in their spread. So we end up having to treat all cases of Pseudomonas infection quite laboriously. When I look back at 10 years of swabs in our practice, and this is from 2008 to 2018, we had in stallions, we had a total of 4,472 stallion swabs that came into our laboratory, not just from our practice, but from across the country. The predominantly thoroughbreds, there are a few non-thoroughbreds involved as well. Then we cultured Pseudomonas aeruginosa in 1.6% of the cases, Klebsiella in total of 4.2%, and that was broken down into 3.5% untyped and only 0.2% of K5, which would be considered, which would have prevented a stallion from going to from breeding, and then the K7 is not thought to be a venereal Klebsiella in 0.7%. So a very, very small percentage of that sample of those 4,472 sets of swabs came up with these particular, what are considered to be the big no-nos here in Europe. But that could be one of your top stallions, and you could use up to several weeks of the breeding season if he were positive. So when we did the same with clitoral swabs, and here we something like 42,000 clitoral swabs were analyzed from 2008 to 2018. Here, only 384 positive Pseudomonas cultures were found at less than 1%, and Klebsiella was the 0.8%. So a very, very small minor proportion. So why the fuss? Well, this is the way we have it regulated here, and I would argue that possibly we have a very low incidence of these potential venereal pathogens, possibly because we are quite very strict about their management. If I look at the endometrial swabs and the culture and PCR results, PCR started roughly in 2012 in our laboratories. We had 40,500 swabs, of which 0.2%, again, very low, were found to have cultured Pseudomonas, and 0.25% Klebsiella. Of these, the endometrial and clitoral swabs, again, small numbers of these, what are considered to be potentially venereal or venereal, classified as venereal Klebsiellas. So we're dealing with a very, very small number of animals. But if we compare that to other parts of the world, and I apologize, I haven't put in the figures here, we seem to be far below the 5% for Klebsiella that is reported from other parts of the world, some parts of the world, but also in a similar low bracket to other parts of the world where the stallions are being swabbed and prevented from breeding unless they are clear, such as in South Africa. So here we go. We've got the issue with Pseudomonas and Klebsiella. We start trying to treat it, as we all know, very difficult to treat. And we always are very rapidly, especially in the cases of Pseudomonas, up against a multi-resistant situation. In a study of swabs and smears, cytology and bacteriology samples taken from mares between 2008 and 2013, Laura Smith, who is a postdoctoral student from the University of Utrecht, who spent some time with us looking at our records, looked at 8,752 sets of cervical swabs and smears. We always do this, we take the swabs in an unguarded manner, and in parallel always do cytology at the same time to put the bacteriology result in relation to an inflammatory response of the endometrial inflammatory response. And she did this on 12 stud farms, and compared to what Sidney Ricketts published in 2007, had very similar results. Unsurprisingly, he had looked at 14,800, almost 14,900 sets of swabs together with his co-workers, and in 70% of the swabs, we had no growth despite an unguarded method of taking them, mixed growth in 6% and a pure growth in 23%. Now, what does that mean? What were we finding here? Primarily, surprise, surprise, beta hemolytic streptococci, E. coli, exactly as you would anticipate, and is published in similar numbers from other parts of the world in numerous other surveys, and then Staph aureus. Together with, out of this group, with the cytology, when determining whether we are dealing with an inflammatory response or not, we then classified only 8.4% of these as being relevant from as an actual infectious process, and the rest were probably contaminants from the swab harvesting methodology. So a low, about 8.4% acute endometritis based on the bacterial result, together characterized by the cytology result. Laura had similar figures, so 74% had no growth, and the distribution of the bacteria was again relatively similar as expected, 13% strep, 5% coli, and then the others, 1% staphylococcus, a low percentage of fungi, and a 5% mixed growth. Now, this is over time, 2006 to 2013, and every year is slightly different, but the pattern stays slightly the same. What is interesting here is that in blue, we have the incidence or the percentage of cultured beta hemolytic strep, and that seems to have a slightly downward trend. Otherwise, the rest are all pretty similar in distribution across those 6 years. I've no real explanation as to why that should be. There's not been any real difference in availability of antimicrobials in that time. Maybe it is purely a factor of stable hygiene and biosecurity that may have changed and helped in the change in the distribution and the reduction in beta hemolytic strep that were isolated. Compared with the work done by Michel Leblanc and the team at Rood and Riddle, we have here 8,752 swabs and smears, and of those we had 8.2% acute endometritis, because both we had a positive result in what's called a positive result from a culture point of view and from a cytology point of view. Michel and the team at Rood and Riddle had slightly different figures there, at 21% of acute endometritis, but I think that just mirrors the different practice conditions, different climates as well, and possibly the interpretation of what of the cytology results as to when it was a tipping point as being a positive or a negative. So I think regional changes practice to practice differences, and within populations, differences are always there and need to be respected in the way we formulate our antimicrobial stewarding programs for our own practices. The cytology here, if the smear was positive, you had a basically a per-cycle conception rate that was around 57%, which was lower than if both the if the cytology result was a negative. Surprise, surprise, in the absence of an inflammatory process, the mare is more likely to go into foal, and we have a successful conception. So these are differences between, again, the two studies, but also some great similarities as well. Here, see what she called 15-day pregnancy rates for different swab and smear combinations and effective treatment. I think what comes out of this, really, without going into detail here, is that there's no statistical relationship overall between treated and untreated mares, except where a positive cytology, in other words, an inflammation was present, which is not unexpected, is what I would anticipate. And what is of concern, though, here, and I don't think much has changed in the last 7 or 8 years, is that if we look at our treatment strategies, not unsurprisingly, mares with Staph aureus were most frequently treated. I think this is something is lost in translation here from the Dutch to English. I think she means what was meant here is that mares with Staph aureus infections took the longest to treat, the most difficult to treat in many cases. Why? Most likely because of the resistance or the sensitivity patterns involved in the resistance patterns. But what is of concern is that more than 50% of mares that just had a positive swab result, irrespective of a negative smear result, were still being treated. In other words, the pressures and the habits of the clinicians were still such that we will grab an antibiotic even though we haven't got the evidence to say that it is necessary, that this case of metritis or perceived metritis or clinically diagnosed metritis, acute endometritis, requires antibiotic treatment. And what's even more concerning is that 1/3 of the mares were being treated with antibiotics even though there was no growth and no inflammatory cells were present on the smears. So that is really that is us treating without any real justification for doing so. So let's fast forward to a paper that was published, I think, this or last week, with a very good podcast you can hear from equine veterinary education, which looks at the improving clinical outcomes via responsible antimicrobial use in horses. And it holds a mirror up to what is happening in the UK. And it also holds a mirror up saying, yes, we are improving as a whole in the UK, in the United Kingdom, with our antimicrobial stewardship, but there's still a lot of work to do. And it highlights the issues in this table of inherent or intrinsic resistance that bacteria have. And what really is of concern here are the big red areas, which is basically, these are intrinsically resistant bacteria and the drugs that they are resistant to. So there isn't much there for us to use anymore. The field of the choice of antibiotics is narrowing all the time, and we should have the highest priority are these critically important antimicrobials, such as enrofloxacin and marbofloxacin, and then the cephalosporins, as we have here in Ceftiofur. And we're just getting more and more limited, but it's up to us to take the pressure off these bacteria so that a selection back towards sensitive bacteria is encouraged. So what have we got left to treat mares and acute endometritis? And here I'm focusing more on the intrauterine treatments. Historically in Newmarket, we had this wonderful combination. I tell you, it worked a treat. It was called Uterine. Vetoquinol was a company that produced it at the time. We had some crystalline penicillin, which we can't get anymore for horses. Crystalline benzyl penicillin, no longer available for horses in the UK. We added a bit of neomycin sulfate, did a good job. We had some polymyxin B. We shouldn't be using that. That's a protected antimicrobial now as well. We had some furadaltone in it and some phragmomycin and added that into a nice solution and pumped it into the mares without thinking twice whether we had and we did not necessarily look at our culture results either, and it worked very well. It came off the market in about 2005, 2006. We all cried and thought, oh, well, what can we use instead? And there was this wonderful stuff that showed up called Exenel. So we quite merrily started throwing a gram of Exenel into the mare's uteruses for a number of years until about 2012, when we suddenly realized we shouldn't be doing this, thanks to Emily. And that's when that corresponds with a drop in its use. And we then started resorting to various other combinations. What's left? Well, we had phragmomycin sulfate until 2 years ago, so we would mix that with depocyllin because we couldn't get the crystalline benzyl penicillin anymore, and noticed that we weren't doing any harm to the mare's endometrium, but probably doing some harm to resistant selection. So when phragmomycin disappeared, the great debate was, do we actually use gentamicin in intrauterine treatments? I was brought up that that was not a good idea, and I still prefer not to, and I'm very squeamish about it. So what other options did we have? Well, not that many. So where are we now? We're now left with depocyllin, neopen, which is neomycin and penicillin, probably of not much use because the neomycin, there's a lot of resistance there. The Exenel we're not using. I probably used 2 grams of Exenel in brood mares last year, and that was with a very guilty conscience. And we use injectable or oral sulfadiazine and trimethoprim, primarily in later gestation in mares with potential placentitis. And otherwise, we're working a lot more with low doses of hydrogen peroxide or pevidine, really trying to also combat biofilm, increase in the use of ecbolics, sometimes some DMSO, acetylcysteine, PRP is coming in and out of fashion, and then the good old-fashioned kerosene and in combination with anti-inflammatories. But basically, my philosophy is very much when in doubt, flush, and the more you flush, the better. And then if you're going to use antibiotics, try to do that in a evidence-based manner. I admit fully that come the beginning of May, I too am panicking and will throw injudiciously, probably try to pull every stop to try to get the mare in the fold. So here are behavior patterns. We looked at the 2 stud farms and the use of ceftiofur, intrauterine use of ceftiofur since 2012. And I wanted to see what our behavior pattern has been in the use of this protected antibiotic. You notice that stud farm 1, which the mare numbers on these farms are roughly the same and have been fairly level over these last 10 years. Stud farm 1 has about 150, averages at about 150 mares of resident mares every year, and stud farm 2 at about 100 and has dropped off slightly. So blue is serving a slightly smaller population than red, where you see until 2015, we were merrily using ceftiofur in the mare's uterus, then decided that that was not the thing to do, and there's been a very big and noticeable drop off, and in a number of grams, you'll see here in 2021, stud farm 1, only about 18 grams, 18 vials were used for treating endometritis cases, and in stud farm 1, it was less than 20 grams. So I've doffed my cap to my two colleagues who have gone along, who are working in that way. It's very representative of what my personal experience is with my caseload on my more public stud farms. What was a distribution of treatments and different drugs used, antimicrobials used over the last 10 years. This is stud farm 1 with a slightly larger population. And you see that this particular clinician has chosen to use more and more in depot penicillin, because we can't get the crystalline penicillin, and he's been using that probably in combination with pharmamycetin, which is now been withdrawn from the market, so we don't have that anymore either. And that started 2 years ago, roughly 2018. So pharmamycin disappeared gradually. There was a small stock left, and those were the last vials that we used. And what are we doing? Combining it with what? Possibly, I think he's been using a bit of gentamicin, because you can see the gentamicin usage went up on that particular farm and has dropped away again. On the second farm with a slightly smaller population, this particular clinician has been fairly consistent in what he's been doing. He obviously tried Neopen 1 year and didn't like it and got rid of it. And so he hasn't used any since then, and he's now resorted to penicillin in a depot form combined with gentamicin. Not ideal, but it's what's left in the way of options that are available to us. I thought then, right, if we're using fewer antibiotics, somebody must be using a lot of fluids. And we looked at the fluid for uterine lavages, and this is the total liters of fluids used by the two different clinicians, stud farm 1 and stud farm 2. And on stud farm 1, you see in 2014, this clinician was sort of in total in his population of mares used somewhere around 120 liters to flush uteruses, probably in 1 liter bags. We also have 3 liter bags. The other vet, the other colleague, had a slightly different pattern and approach. And what's interesting is that in the last season, they're basically using the same amount of same volumes, slightly different numbers of mares, but the lavage volume has not necessarily gone up exponentially with the loss of availability of effective antibiotics, but a lot of lavage is being done and being used. It might also be a reflection on the relative health of their mares if they haven't had to use more lavages than they have done. So, antibiotic stewardship at Rossdale's in the last 10 years, what have we learned and what have we achieved? Well, we've achieved one thing. We've replaced ceftiofur which is a protected drug for the management of uterine infections and prophylaxis with other treatment strategies. We've reduced the amounts of some antibiotics that have been in use, a good number of them. But more importantly, otherwise we wouldn't be in business, we've maintained a per cycle conception and pregnancy rates to our client satisfaction. I'm sorry I haven't got the slides to show you on that, but I assure you we're still in business, so we can't be doing too much wrong. We've certainly educated and raised awareness about antimicrobial stewardship amongst our vets, and more so also amongst our clients and our in-house technical staff. There's still a lot of improvement it needs to be to maximize improvement is still needed to maximize culture and sensitivity guided treatment of actual endometritis to minimize antimicrobial resistance. And hopefully other markers will come along to assist us in using this. Obviously the inflammatory markers such as serum amyloid A and fibrogen are still there.
Emailing to kmcdtn@gmail.
And so that basically brings me to the end of my presentation. And on the right there, you have a snowy looking Ouija board, a mare that many of you on your side of the pond also recognize, and I have the pleasure of seeing on a daily basis. This was, I think, 2 winters ago when her bronze was covered in snow in her yard. And what you can't see is that the stable next to her, to this one here on that side, actually she had her head staring out, and she looks at herself every day in bronze too. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for inviting me for this discussion. And Emma, here's a view over Newmarket and what you see. And if you remember very well from the top of Warren Hill. Now, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that horses have been galloping up and down this hill since probably about 1605, 1606. And we're still doing that every day. This was taken last Sunday. And here we have Tattersalls, the Tattersall Sales Pavilions and the Tattersall Sales Complex, fields that belong to the National Stud here. Here we have the Rowley Mile Racecourse, the grandstand, which is the Millennium Grandstand, and this is the racecourse. We have two racecourses in Newmarket on which the first of the annual classic races are run, the 1,000 and 2,000 guineas. We don't have an oval course, these are dogleg shaped courses. And over here in the distance, you can see what is an outline of the July course, where racing takes place from the end of mid-June onwards till the end of August, and then they come back to the Rowley Mile. And this line along here, it represents something called the Devil's Dyke. And if you go onto a satellite image of Newmarket, of the UK, you will see the Devil's Dyke. Nobody knows who built it, but it's been there for over 1,000 years. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and also many thanks to the people who helped me prepare this talk, in particular Lorraine Palmer, who very kindly waded through the fluid and antibiotic use for the last few years. Susan Yarrow, as secretary in a laboratory, who painstakingly went through the 10 years of laboratory of swab results. Emily Floyd and Laura Smith. Thank you.
Dr. Barrelet, that was an absolutely amazing talk. Thank you. And I do appreciate the beautiful view of Newmarket. It makes me terribly homesick. That was incredible information. I don't know that any of us here have had the shock value of ceftiofur being measured in pounds or kilos. That's pretty darn scary. So really, really fascinating information and very, very thought-provoking. And as you said, that Europe has taken a slightly different stance on this and is moving ahead. There are regulatory bodies chasing antimicrobial use in veterinarians, definitely in small animal and the ruminant industry. We haven't quite got it there yet. And one of the questions that one of the people that has written in has commented on is essentially the widespread finding of antimicrobials in the barns and the stables that we visit. And so the question is, how do we veterinarians regain the control of the use of antimicrobials? And so I realize that the legislation in this country is quite different, but did, from a historical perspective, the push for this regulation and the guidelines and picking up a sort of a consensus culture to be more responsible, was that driven by regulatory issues? Was it driven by treatment failure? Was it driven by the veterinary community picking up on their conscience for better stewardship? What's your thoughts on that in terms of where we can go from here?
Possibly a little from all of the above, but I think there is also another aspect, and that's a cultural aspect. North America, especially the US, if you go through statistics, has the highest per capita use of medication, be it prescription only or over the counter, in the two-legged, and it is transposed probably to the four-legged creature. And I think that's recognized. The European culture is perhaps slightly, in the two-legged as well, is probably slightly less medication orientated. So there's possibly, I think, a cultural divide there. I think the fact that I'll give you a very simple example. My children and my sister's children, and the way my sister managed her children in New Jersey, and my wife and I managed our children in Europe. If our kids grazed their knee or had a snotty nose, they were kicked out and thrown back out into the yard and told to get on with it. My sister, and this is no criticism whatsoever of my sister at all, but in her mindset, if the children had something, she had something in her handbag to give them, to help them get through whatever crisis it was, be it a grazed knee or a snotty nose. And I'm using this, perhaps as an extreme, not as an extreme, but as an example in the difference in the approach to medication and the use of drugs in general. And I think we also see it not just in the use of antibiotics. I remember the days when the American Horse Show Association and USEF and so on allowed, I think, a cocktail of 3 different non-steroidals in sport horse classes, whereas in Europe, there we were at the no bute levels, partly also enforced by legislation in some European countries. But it was felt if the horse is a little bit sore, it should be helped. I think, and I'm not criticizing, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but what I'm saying is there are cultural differences in the way we approach different parts of the world approach the issues of medication. And I think that's also reflected in the use of antibiotics. So the realization here in Europe has probably dawned a little sooner, but also is possibly fallen on more fruitful ground, because there's probably possibly a more willingness to try to minimize the use of medication or antibiotics, certainly antibiotics in both human and the human and the animal fields.
Yeah, yes, I think there's certainly, that has to be taken into consideration, not just the regulatory and the legislative differences, but the cultural difference. So it's a very interesting perspective. We have another comment, obviously thanking you for a great talk. And this person would like to know what your thoughts are on using systemic probiotics or uterine transformation to correct dysbiosis, and as methods for potentially reducing antimicrobial drug usage. If you have any thoughts on that, that would be super.
I've certainly not used those approaches. I think we are learning more and more about the uterine environment. I think we are now all recognizing that it was not the sterile environment we were all told or taught, especially those of us who went to university before the year 2000. It is the uterine environment has got its own flora. I think we're learning more and more about that as we go on. The uterine biome is going to be more of a discussion point, and hopefully and possibly will give us more and some effective treatment options in the long run. And I think here we have the whole issue also, fascinating issue of the biofilm. I think that's all integrates into itself, but I don't necessarily think I would be tempted at this point to go and take some, to go into my pharmacy and get some probiotic and mix up a liter of probiotic and pour it into uterus. Mind you, years ago, when I was seeing practice in Ireland, one of the leading equine repro vets there boldly said to me when I was going on about flushing uteruses, it doesn't really matter what you use to flush a uterus with. It's the washing machine effect. It's the volume going through there, and you can use water out of a puddle, or you can use sterile water, whichever you want. Well, sure. Now I'm not. He might have been right. I've certainly never tried puddle water.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think we've given some people so much to think about, and I will, just to let everybody know, the resources that Dr. Barrelet has shared with us that we may wish to reference, I'll try and put them up on our Gluck Equine Research Center website for people to have ready access to. So there'll be a link on the homepage so that people can find them, to try and encourage everybody to think about this. I think it's a really important aspect. Dr. Barrelet, in the middle of all your very busy week, we do very much appreciate the amount of effort and time that has gone into this presentation, and you dragging yourself away from the celebrations after the end of a long day, teaching your students and rushing your dinner. We hope we're not responsible for any indigestion, but we do very, very much appreciate you sharing your data with us. Very, very informative. Thank you very much indeed. Very, very kind.